Welcome everybody to this session, the first of the day's sessions. It's about European values. My name is Wojciech. I'm the director, one of the directors of NSE Ideas, and it's my privilege to chair this particular session on European values. I'll start off with just a couple of observations. In 1956, November 1956, the first day of the Hungarian uprising, broadcast on the national radio network, broadcast to the West, we are going to die for Hungary and for Europe. He was killed later that morning. The broadcaster died so that Hungary might remain not only Hungary, but also European. To die for one's country and for Europe is a phrase Milan Kundera, the Czech writer, added, that could not be thought in Moscow, because Russia is not a European country, as we would understand Europe and its value system. The broadcaster died for the values of Europe. And when we think of the Ukraine war, we think, in fact, how European Russia is or has become. That's a matter for debate. In his essay, Kidnapped West, Milan Kundera writes that about Russian self-regard, nothing seems horrible to them compared with the fate of Russia. And we Europeans are indifferent to that fate because they've made it for themselves. It's not our heritage. That essay, Kidnapped West, which was written in 1985 by Milan Kundera in French, the language that he chose to write in the rest of his life, has just been recently republished in the United Kingdom. Now, if Russia and its value system, such as it is seen as a threat to Europe, a strategic threat, in the words of the European Commission, China, of course, is a systemic threat and has been identified as one. And I thought I'd just bring your attention to a new theorist from Fudan University, Zhang Weiwei, who is very close to Xi Jinping. In fact, he gave a lecture to the Communist Party Politburo last year in what was called a collective study session for the leading party members, in which he castigated European values on the grounds that the Europeans arrogated for themselves the right to claim that they were universal. There are no universal values, he wrote. Different civilizations have different value systems. Chinese values happen to be clearly superior because at the heart of the value system in China is the Confucian idea of good governance. And at the heart of the Western value system, he argued, was competition for individual rights that produced very bad governance and produced Brexit and Donald Trump and an America at war with itself. And Zhang went further and argued that there was no place, in fact, in the 21st century for European values because the future would be determined anyway by technology and artificial intelligence. The value system of computers is probably going to be very important. So here we have three, I think, policies that our panelists may or may not address. Are there European values? And if so, what are they? Do they differ from that of other societies, Russia, of course, being the immediate neighbor? And if there are European values, are they universal? But I would just conclude, of course, that disturbingly, the European value system is challenged from within Europe. A survey last year found that 61% in Britain of 18 to 34-year-olds believed that they would be better off without Parliament. An astounding 46% thought that army rule would be the best way of governing the country. And in the United States, only 2% of Americans trust the federal government to do what is right, whatever right might be in the eyes of the respective respondents. So that's enough for me. Let's start. We have three speakers. Oana-Cristina Popa, head of the EU Delegation to Montenegro, Romanian ambassador to Croatia and Serbia. You can see the rest of her biography in the program. Wojciech Sorry, I have such difficulty. That's what happens if you spend too much time in the executive lounge. Drinking Polish vodka, I hasten to add, so you're partly responsible for these two countries. Who is editor-in-chief of Visegrad Insight and chairman of Res Publica Foundation in Warsaw, amongst many other things. And finally, my colleague, Kristen Dandecker from King's College, professor of military sociology for many years, has worked closely through most of his career with the British Army on a variety of issues. We will start with Oana. Speakers will speak only for 15 minutes, and please, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Good morning, and thank you for giving me the opportunity today to talk about Europe. As some of you may know, as some noticed last night during the dinner talks, I am an enthusiastic Europeanist, primarily because if it weren't for the EU, I wouldn't be here today to talk about the EU, and I think many of you can relate to that. So what I will be trying to do today is to, first of all, launch more questions, probably than answers, but also to give a sense of what European values are, how do they work, university or not, and why not? How do they apply to the EU accession process and to the enlargement, because that's mostly my work in what I do today. And last but not least, how do they come into play today with an EU enlargement package that has expanded to 10 countries with very different backgrounds and with very different stages of accession to the EU. So, traditionally, if I would attempt a definition, the EU is a community of values. It was built on a set of values comprising of human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, and human rights. And yes, many, if not all of those, are universal. How does this work when it comes to the accession process? As you know, and many of us have been through this in my country, but I have seen it at play in other countries at various stages of accession. The enlargement process is a merit-based journey, let's say, which has to prove adherence to EU democratic values and to meet criteria set at the start of the process. And this criteria is known as the Copenhagen criteria, and it relates to political criteria, economic criteria, and administrative and institutional capacity. Now, as also many of you know, it is not a negotiation in the traditional sense. That's why we use less and less negotiations today, and we speak about accession talks, because it's mostly an adaptation to a certain criteria and less so an actual bargaining. But what probably complicates things today is that the core of the EU enlargement process is rule of law. So from all those values that I have outlined, rule of law encompasses all of them. And because the geopolitical and geostrategic environment is constantly changing, and new elements come into play around the EU, it seems as if the EU accession process per se is a moving target. But it is not a moving target. If we look historically at all the enlargement waves, the basic sort of baseline of criteria and values has remained the same. But what has changed is the environment around the accession process. What has changed is the EU itself, which has evolved from what it was 20, 30 years ago. Let's say, take it from the end of the Cold War to today. The EU of today is definitely not the EU of the 90s, and is not the EU of the 2000s. And also what is different is the different experience of the candidate countries. So we are looking at again, today, large number of countries in a relatively small place with very different stages of development. And it's very difficult to apply those values and these criteria universally. So sometimes, unfortunately today more than often, many of these countries feel that they are treated unfairly, in the sense that the rules of the game are changing while playing. But in fact, that is not so. The values are the same and the criteria is the same. The main problem with European values in the enlargement process is that candidate countries tend to want to reap all the benefits of the enlargement process, be it in the process of accession talks or, of course, as a end game to become a member. But they're also trying to cut corners and not adhere and apply in action all the conditionality that is required of them in order to reap those benefits. So it's a game that has been played for a while. However, because of the constant changing nature of the geostrategic environment, and today in particular the war in Ukraine, this is not something that is acceptable anymore for the EU. So there has to be a certain baseline that has to be the same for all. And probably the best example today, and I would add this as a European value, is solidarity, which has been very much proven during the COVID pandemic, but also today with standing with Ukraine. Those countries that are really committed to those values have aligned with support to Ukraine, with the common foreign and security policy, with the EU imposed sanctions and so on. So there are new elements added. They're not necessarily in addition. They also can be included in this basic set of EU values. But it is one very important component that it is looked at today, because the way Europe and the EU perceives the war in Ukraine, it's a war on values. It's a war that Russia has declared on European values and that the Ukrainians fight for. So that is probably the novelty since the war in Ukraine started on how some countries perceive that there's always additions to the EU enlargement process. It's also because probably, like I said, the rule of law being the core matter of the enlargement process, today it's not just rule of law per se, it is also alignment with the common foreign and security policy. So that tends to sort of counterbalance the importance of the rule of law and adds to it. So it's not just rule of law, but it's also alignment with common foreign and security policy. And that is probably the main change that the EU has gone through, that it has started to add more hardcore matters to its initially soft core, because the EU is being perceived as a soft power entity, although I mean that's debatable because many of the soft power elements are very hardcore today, such as fighting disinformation and fake news and so on. But we will get to that later. And because of its changing nature, it started as an economic union, and then it became a political one, and now it has these security and foreign policy components, which are very strong. Again, a changing, dynamic, evolving union that has to adapt to the challenges of today. The main problem with European values that we see in the Western Balkans today is implementation. It is very difficult to quantify how European values are being applied in the accession process and in everyday life. Because declaratively, everybody adheres to European values. Basically, nobody from the candidate countries is saying, no, we reject European values or we don't like. On the contrary. But when it comes to implementing European values, oftentimes we hit a wall of words and very little action. So while everybody is enthusiastically pro-European, when it comes to carrying out certain, oftentimes uneasy reforms that relate to those values, that process is much slower or sometimes absent. All the countries want the benefits of the EU, but not all of them at the same time and in the same pace want to meet the obligations that create the conditions in order to reap those benefits. Now, to narrow down a little bit, to go to the enlargement package of today. So, as you know, the enlargement package initially of the Western Balkans, 6 plus Turkey, has now expanded to 3 new countries in the Eastern Partnership: Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, and they are all together in this group called the European Political Community. While this is good for enlargement, and certainly if there's any silver lining at all with the Russian aggression in Ukraine, is that it has brought enlargement back to the forefront. It has put enlargement as a priority for the EU on the table, but it is not that simple, primarily because we have a very diverse group of 10 countries, 6 of which in the Western Balkans are crammed in a very small space with very different issues and with very different stages, both of development and stages of EU accession, but also with very different approach to the EU. So, for example, if you look at the support to the EU in the Western Balkans 6, you will have a wide variety ranging from extremely high, over 75%, in Montenegro, which is the most Euro-enthusiastic of all, and which has an all-time high percentage of EU support. Just in the last few days, the latest opinion poll came out. To Serbia, which has dropped under 50% for the first time since it has opened accession talks. To North Macedonia, which unfortunately was a very Euro-enthusiastic country, but also partially because of our fault, it has been extremely disappointed with the way it was rewarded for doing everything we asked, but this has to do with the decision-making process internally at the EU level. And then, of course, to Albania, that mostly is looking for EU funds and not so much for the rest. And then it's, of course, Kosovo and Bosnia, which are initially were in the same group, but now with Bosnia receiving candidate status, we basically have 4 groups of candidate countries in the Western Balkans, and again, in a very small space, and many of those countries used to be one country 20 years ago, so very complex historical circumstances. So for the EU, it's a big challenge, but it's important to stay committed and to stay focused, because obviously this is the only way forward. And like I said, the war in Ukraine has opened a completely new front when we talk about values, enlargement, and accession. I will stop here, and there are, of course, a number of other issues which I look forward to opening up after the other panelists speak and during the Q&A session.
Thank you very much. Wojciech.
Thank you. I would start by saying why now I'm not speaking so much about journalism, though we do work on the journalist platform, but now I put a different hat, which we also have at Visegrad Insight, which is we conduct strategic foresight for a number of years, 5 years now, trying to map out from the existing research and the great minds that Central Europe has a structured response to what can go wrong, what else can go wrong, in an effort to have a discussion that probably should have happened before Brexit and many other decision points. It should have preceded a decision in different policies, including European Union, because this way probably you would not have this excuse of, oh, I didn't know, and you remember that first day after Brexit, the most Googled term according to Google Trends was, what is Brexit and what is the EU? So what we're trying to do, and we're investing our time in our enterprise, is to bring a collective reflection in Central Europe, and I'm eternally grateful to Ratiu for it, because it helps also to structure some of our thinking, and to bring this as partly a voice of the ambition is to be a voice also in Brussels in discussion in the EU. One of these exercises that we've conducted in the past year was around this Conference on the Future of Europe, one of the big EU efforts to think about the future, and I have to admit that I'm an optimist in a different sense, in Central European sense perhaps, because definition is usually pessimist is someone who says, oh, it cannot be worse, this is really bad, and the optimist says, well, it can be worse. And this is where we try to fill in the gap also in the discussion on the future of the EU, which from the Brussels perspective is always about how good can it be and how great scenarios are ahead of us. And by investing our time in the inquiry how bad it can get, we're certainly not trying to advocate for it, we just want to bring some warning shots. So what we've done, and I'm happy to share some of my thoughts reflecting also on the questions of Mr. Chairman, are what is going to be, what Central Europeans at least may be thinking of what this war will mean for the future of Europe. And let me first start by trying to answer the question of European values. I'm not so worried about 2% or even some 10% in some countries trusting the government or the parliament. I would be worried if 70 to 90% would be trusting our political institutions, because I believe this is the statistics that comes in from China or North Korea or many others. The feature of Europe and European thinking is to be self-critical and critical and not being too trustful in, especially in the political process, which I believe is the core of our Western existence that kept us going, very critical of what we're doing, and still allowed us for action in that context. I also say that in the very beginning, and I won't take much longer, that my understanding of the European project is it's also pessimistic. It started from pessimism, because it started from a total failure, right? And it's been a peace project at the very beginning, based on the tremendous failure of the First and Second World War. It was essentially, Timothy Snyder would say, it's a project of failed empires. The only missing failed empire in Europe that we need is Russia. And until it fails, Europe will not be completely free and united and peaceful. And this is what I believe this war is mostly about, but of course there are also other issues. Not so much, I don't know if you can fight a war for values. That's usually a very dangerous idea, I think. But definitely it's a war, it's a defensive war for freedom of the people who want to have a right to choice. And through this war they also self-realize how free they can be. And that's so important in Ukraine. Now in the EU, I think this realization, self-realization that the EU has been a peace project is often forgotten. And the biggest value of the EU still is that it has achieved the longest period of peace in Europe so far. It wasn't possible for many reasons, but also it's important to know that it's peaceful because there is also United States protective arm, and it's a collective defense that is included in our settlement that keeps us peaceful, relatively peaceful, and united in the EU. Now, in 1990s, I think we started to believe that apart from a peace project, we can say that this is exactly, Europe is about some set of values, and this normative agenda came in with the sense of end of history, so everybody need to lean in to whatever the agenda setters thought it should be. And to a certain extent it worked, and Central Europe has been an example. Countries changed tremendously, these V4 countries, Visegrad countries, for example, and now there's a trouble because maybe we believed it too much. I think it's very valid that to look at the EU in this way, because the change and the ambition set forth was important, and it delivered. But now we are also in a third, if I may say, moment in which this question of geostrategy, geo-economy are self-defining for the EU agenda. And the EU is trying to be a political actor and maybe a foreign policy actor at times. And here, despite my earlier pessimistic quotes, I would say that it's not entirely unsustainable. You could see that in the past, that Europe has been building a strategic autonomy of sorts. It's better at doing it rather than talking, especially when it's Mr. Macron who tries to say something about it. But the European Union has been getting more self-sustainable and delivering more capacity to act. If you reflect back on a couple of examples. Energy packages, and recently Green Deal, is essentially an effort to build European, well, if not we are energy poor continent, but this is still an honest effort not to be so dependent on foreign sources. Brexit negotiations, despite all odds, resulted in a stronger, successful foreign policy action on behalf of the EU. Despite expectations of division, also that has been tried during the negotiations, kept united front and was more successful than Britain, to the surprise not only of the British government, but also many Europeans. Vaccine response, if you think from the point of view of smaller countries across Baltics, many countries, even in the Western Balkans, that delivered something that EU was not ever designed to do. And in terms of delivering for the people kind of the real thing, which is protecting lives, it did tremendously well. And then you are disappointed, rightly so, we're self-critical, because it could have done better, but still, this is an achievement that we have not seen before. Next Generation Fund, the indebtedness, and nobody's going to be crazy happy about getting indebted, but the ability of the EU actually to generate additional funds on its own and to invest on its own, and probably we'll see more of that in the coming years. This is a new achievement, giving again ability to act as a political actor. The perverse name European Peace Facility, that started for some other purposes and now funds most of the EU war effort, so from a peace project to funding arms exports, that's quite a way that EU has went. It is an instrument that is going to be meaningful, maybe not as much as many other individual countries support, but it's still, in terms of going from zero arms exports to 5 billion already euro and probably more, this is a very significant step forward in shaping the future of Europe. Russian sanctions, still united despite Hungary. Enlargement policy on the question of understanding that our values are of course important, but it's also about our interests. European Union took a step of inviting Ukraine, Moldova, and we're talking about Western Balkans, because we understand it's about our interests. It's about securing Europe from meddling and instability, which costs us dearly, and of course these countries as well. But it's also about resource. You can argue very well that Ukraine is the first climate war of the 21st century. That it's about the tremendous resource that is in Ukraine that Europe needs for all these ambitions that I mentioned have been going on earlier. So I think we need definitely, and I'll stop here, a self-reflection, some criticism. It will not come from EU institutions and Brussels, because it is such a strange thing to have EU institutions altogether. After all, in Europe that has been most of the time self-critical, and the EU institutions are the most optimistic political institutions maybe in the history of the world. And I think that's good, that's great, and because then we can have a discussion, and we need this source of optimism and thinking about building and constructing the future from Brussels. Now I think what we also need, and we've heard that with the speech of the President of the Commission last year, September, when she said we should have listened to Central Europe, because also of this sobering realization that things are not always going as EU has been planning, and these voices of warning and nudges to the EU project is something that I believe Central Europeans can also deliver, should be delivered much more.
Thank you very much, Wojciech. Christopher.
Does this work?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Good morning, and thank you for coming to listen to me and to the panel. Three things in my a lot of time. Why is this topic so important? What are the values? We've heard a bit about that already, so reasonably briefly. What are the challenges to them, and how might we address them? So why is this topic so important? As we've heard, the most immediate is the shock of war, a major interstate war, for the first time in nearly 80 years on the European continent. A challenge to international law because of the forcible breaching of state boundaries, the seizure of territory, and as we saw with recent events, a variety of war crimes, not least eco-crime on a large scale, which perhaps we can talk about. But there is a deeper, a far wider context, and I'll be structured at some gloomier note than my panelists, about which we've heard a little bit yesterday from Professor Bose. If you look back from 2023 to the 21st century so far, you could argue that rather than being an age of the universalizing of European values, we're living in a rather dangerous world of autocracy, a global age of autocracy, and populist despots drawn on ethnic, religious, and nativist ideologies and appeals to secure and maintain political power. As we heard yesterday, there is no shortage of examples. Modi's India, Erdogan's Turkey, Putin's Russia, Xi's PRC. I'll share your attention to that in his introductory remarks. And of course, we do include Trump, and if you like a joke, although it's rather a sick joke, the attempt of Boris Johnson to trash parliamentary institutions, which has had some connection with the opinion poll data that our chair also referred to. His contempt for procedure and the institutions of parliamentary democracy have not done post-Brexit Britain much good. Will we recover? Interesting question. The more democratic world, in this global context of, if I can use the shorthand, despotism, must feel, I think it must feel, a little bit encircled, not least because of the challenge of the global south, which is, I'm sure you are aware, by no means committed to the Ukraine cause, by no means committed to the Western project of liberating Ukraine, whether it's to its 22 or its 2014 borders. It's by no means supported, and South Africa is a classic example of that. So in terms of exporting EU values, the global south is a pretty good arena in which to try and achieve that. In addition, the problem of, we haven't actually heard this today yet, but refugees, migration, and social anxieties about population movements from south to north, the whole question of an aging population with a low birth rate would be pragmatic and obviously welcome new members. But there's the question of the anxieties caused by that, and the whole question of borders and assimilation. It's easy to welcome people if you're confident about assimilation to the values about which we're talking about today. What are those values? Well, we've heard, or probably not too much, but we've heard, we will be repeating material. We've heard about human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, the European Court of Justice, human rights, in which no discrimination by race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and protection of personal data are key points. And I won't explore with your intelligence and go through it again. You've heard a version of that before and done very well in the earlier contributions. If we pause there, we can say so far so good, but there are 2 or 3 questions I'd like to pose here. First of all, are these European values, are they not just European, they're Western? The Western, they became at the heart, through the Western rationalism, at the heart of the European Union project. And do we say, well, furthermore, they're not just Western, they're universal. You can identify them with some of the universal institutions which apparently we are happy and content to live under, not least the UN Charter. And one of the consequences of ecocide, to which I referred earlier, the dam and other war crimes by Russia, is that these are not just an affront to European values, they're an affront to the UN Charter, to which the European values have contributed, did contribute. And one of the reasons, I think, for the optimism and that sunny disposition of the European Union. Why not? It has much to be proud of. There's a second sort of problem, that it's one thing to incorporate values into institutions, it's quite another thing to assume on that basis that people are willing to live up to them, who actually believe in them, and are going to act on them. So institutionalized values do not necessarily convert into belief, and actually we heard a little bit about that in conditionality of this session. And I find the most tragic example of that is going back to the UN. The UN Security Council. There are people sitting around in that Security Council, which is embedded in some of the key values I've talked about, and do not believe them at all. They would trash them in public anyway. So, as the EU has expanded eastwards, and previous, first of all, especially since 2004, it's by no means evident that the acceptance of religious and cultural pluralism is as accepted further east as it is in Western Europe. Even Western Europe is troubled by the same things that trouble Central and Eastern Europe. And if I may refer to Hungary, Orbán's statement, which got a lot of press in July 1918, where he said, and it did do the rounds on social media as well as the international press. I quote him, he said, every European country has the right to defend its Christian culture, the right to reject the ideology of multiculturalism, and the right to reject immigration and to defend the traditional family. I would argue that migration and the tensions caused by that Western Europe is not entirely insulated from those sorts of thoughts and beliefs. And I think opinion poll data confirm that. What are the challenges and responses? I'm looking at my clock. I want to pick up on something, unless I misheard you, Christopher brought up right in the introductory comments. That European values are not simply threatened by autocracy abroad, they're threatened by some internal social processes, by social liberalism's critique of, if you like, liberal values. What do I mean by that? Well, surely one of the key values, European values, to which we would all subscribe and expect new members to subscribe to, is freedom of speech. Yet, at the heart of it, we see the Parliament in the Irish Republic with legislation to severely restrict freedom of speech, with some interesting punishments and sanctions associated with it. How does freedom of speech sit with the provision, the compulsory provision of comfort zones by law, where people are protected by speech that might offend them or cause them discomfort? And this is at the heart of the British and wider university system and across the Atlantic. So, safe spaces and freedom of speech are in tension. One of the great paradoxes about empire, and I'm not talking the Russian empire, but empire as an idea, is that one of the consequences of empire and the development of the West and the universalizing of its values is that for all sorts of interesting reasons we can talk about, imperial guilt is a very distinctive feature of Western culture. This leads to very interesting consequences, not least to a lack of confidence in pushing through any kind of assimilationist project to deal with new members arising from outside Europe. Classic example in my experience, having spent 20 odd years going in and out of it, is Sweden, where assimilationist projects are subject to the charge of racism. And that always leads to the problem. There are questions of underinvestment, social investment in human capital and so on. But this that dimension is something we shouldn't forget. My basic point is, if you don't have confidence in your European values, you're not going to be very strong in pushing them in regard to the assimilation project. I'll end on 2 or 3 comments. 5 minutes? It says here on my clock. We face, from the European point of view, some really hard choices for our generation. Sorry, your generation. I'll get rid of that one. And the generation after. Looking ahead 10, 20, 30 years. What's the relative importance of human rights, especially on the international stage, a welcoming approach to people who are seeking to escape ghastly regimes abroad? They deserve a welcome, don't they? What is the balance between that and provision of security and dealing with social anxieties of populations already here to which I've heard? That's a tricky one, and all governments are going to have to face that. Last 2 points. Our doubts and anxieties that I mentioned in the discussion are being exploited through disinformation and through funding by Russia and China and others. But I think as they do so, what I'm saying has any validity, especially China like us, do we need to work that hard to undermine the West? If the West can be relied upon to do the job itself. I think that's a question that we need to think very hard about. But I don't want to leave you with this idea of the European Union as a global world of despotisms where they got the action. They're the ones who are going to be running the show, not just China. There are 2 fundamental weaknesses, we can talk about this. There are 2 fundamental weaknesses of the despotism to which I've referred. And we need to play on that. We're going to push back. One is succession. I'm not referring to it. But one of the weaknesses of despots is how they organise succession. One of the strengths of parliamentary democracies is, one of the reasons the US has got a semi-broken political system, is the legitimacy of the peaceful transfer of power. If you lose, you say, that's fine, I can come around again. That's a fundamental feature which comes out of the European values that we're talking about. Succession is rather difficult to despots, and of course they can play on that. Our fear of a post-Putin world is very good for him. He can play on that. You think your problems with me, look who might come in on my place, or look at some tribalistic system with nuclear weapons that might replace me. The second thing that we should remember with the autocratic context is the quality of advice to leaders. One of the great strengths, I think, of the value system we've been talking about is that not only do you have a succession of political leadership, they lose, they leave, but the quality of the leadership, if you have an independent civil service and you have decent advisory systems, is better than you get autocratic systems, which tend to rely on people who tell the boss what he wants to hear. And Christopher will know more about this than me, but my sources tell me that one of the great shocks in China was no one expected a Trump victory. And the intelligence systems were saying, why didn't you? Why were we not told? So I think when we look at the threats to European values, we shouldn't underestimate the weaknesses of the despots who are seeking to undermine us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all our panelists, and first of all I'd like to thank them for keeping within time. It's an admirable discipline. The old joke of the academic panel, the third panelist went on 3 times longer than everyone else. And realizing he lost his audience, he said, I'm terribly sorry, I think I've overrun my time. But you have to understand I labour under 2 disadvantages. One, I left my watch in my hotel room this morning. And secondly, there isn't a clock in this room. To which someone in the audience said, no, but there is a calendar behind you. Anyway, I am going to ask, with the usual abuse of chair's prerogatives, each of the panelists a question. But when they answer it, I will also invite them to address each other's comments if they would like to do that as well. Then, because we have a lot of time until 12 o'clock, I would like to ask Professor Lieven, who is one of the most distinguished historians of Russia, if he could say something about Russian values in the context of what we have been discussing today. Because I have been very rude personally about Russian values, or rather Mila Kundera was very rude about Russian values, so I think we should give a Russian voice a chance. And then I would like to invite Samantha Bose to say something about Turkey and European values. This is the longest debate in the history of the European Union, whether Turkey will ever join. And it is about migrant workers, it is also about socioeconomic circumstances, but it is very largely about values. And then we will open it up to the audience, so please think of the criticisms as well as questions you would like. Now, if I may turn to our first panelist, and implementation. And if you will allow me just 3 or 4 minutes to put forward a proposition I always do when we discuss values. And I did last year at the conference, so some of you here may remember that. We make a mistake sometimes of confusing a value and a norm. And a value, a norm, is the implementation of a value. And it's going to be heavily influenced by your history, by your traditions, by your, in this case, Europe is a project, European Union of nation states. There is no idea of creating a supranational Europe anymore. That dream has gone. It was there in the 50s and 60s. The European Union is stuck with the nation state. But the nation state evolves over time, of course, as you were saying. Evolution is very important. So I would just give you an example of values and norms, if I may, which is my favorite one. The values of Christianity haven't changed in my country for 900 years. And if you go to Yorkshire, you'll go to one of the great cathedrals, which is York Minster. That how has Christianity been celebrated in those 900 years? Well, when York Minster opened its doors, they burnt Jews outside, because that's how you celebrated Christianity 900 years ago. In the 16th century, there were no Jews to burn because they'd all been expelled in 1272. We burnt witches, old ladies, for the most part. In the 17th century, they actually burnt a cat for breaking the Sabbath, for catching a mouse on the Sabbath, which you're not supposed to do. And in the 1980s, when York Minster was struck by lightning, the Archbishop of York rushed onto television to assure us that this was not an act of God, except in the insurance sense of the word, which there was no insurance provision. So you can see that in those 900 years, Christianity and Christian values remain, but how you celebrate those values differs. So my question to you is, much of the problems the European Union has with Central and East European countries is that their history has been different from that of Western Europe for much of the time. Perhaps they only shared it in the 20th century. In one sense, they have the importance of religion has been so different. Religion has played a much more politically vital role in Eastern and Central Europe, particularly under communism, than it has in Western Europe since the 1950s. And that we sometimes accuse our Central and East European brethren of portraying values when what we should be saying is your norms are different from ours. And I think part of the Brexit debate and the success of the Brexiteers was saying that British traditions and the British way of doing things were being threatened by a European Union that wasn't allowing Britain to be Britain, whatever that meant.
Yes, thank you. No, absolutely. I agree. But I would want to make a clear distinction here. I think that Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans and Turkey and the Eastern neighborhood are very different groups for historical reasons and for recent historical reasons. So while Central and Eastern Europe has adapted in a much speedier pace to both the values and the norms, to the norms, absolutely, because otherwise they wouldn't be in. The recent history of the Western Balkans puts them in a different kind of spot here. And first of all, because the collective memories that are much fresher than those of Central and Eastern Europe, and also because the elements that have been included, for example, in the rule of law chapter, where traditionally you have judicial reforms, fight against corruption, organized crime, and so on. Well, in the Western Balkans, you have war crimes, which was something that Croatia has been struggling with a lot as the first country that had that element in the acquis after the big bang of 10+2 enlargement. So, Brussels oftentimes doesn't have the luxury to go into all these micro details because we do tend to look at countries as a group, and in a sense it's good because the Western Balkans will eventually have to join as a group. There is no point or added value if they don't. But it's also important to look individually at each case. And especially today with rising Euroscepticism in some countries, like I've mentioned, you have this debate whether, shall we just get the benefits of what we're getting now, such as European funds, which are not negligible at all, because it's difficult and it takes time to do rule of law reform that entails both values and norms, or shall we take the time to do everything? And I don't think that Europe can afford to let itself drag into that debate, because then as much as we want to prepare these countries to be ready to join the single market, we cannot say, let's just take care of the economics and forget about the rest, because that's part of the discourse in some of the candidate countries themselves. They're telling us, let's take care of the economy and we'll do rule of law later. Well, no, you have to do them in parallel. If you don't do them in parallel, then you cannot have a sound economy, because everything is connected, right? A transparent, efficient business climate depends on the rule of law and values and norms. So we are completely resisting that, but at the same time, you do have countries that say, this is too complicated because of our historical circumstances and our societal restrictions. We can't do this on the fast track. So let's get the most of what we can today. And some of those countries are really, really concerned with development and EU funds, and they say, this is something that is a concrete deliverable to the people. So people see that through EU funds, they get EU projects that influence their daily lives to the better, and not just the big ones like the energy package or the Green Deal, but infrastructural projects, all sorts of things, even at the micro-societal level. And then they tend to just put the rule of law, which is concerned with all we have discussed, on the back burner. And that's extremely dangerous. But yes, we in our work, we do make the difference between norms and values, because the acquis at the end of the day is about norms. But when you, for example, carry out a significant judicial reform, that also translates in adhering to values at the end of the day, because you come to work by it, and it also changes your mindset. And to speak about my country, I think that the greatest benefit of the EU was the change in the mindset of people, and then eventually you come to act upon values as well. I have seen this change also with Croatia. Croatia is a completely different country today than it was 20 years ago, and people were extremely skeptical that they will never do what they are asked. But they did it because they really wanted to, and now they function more and more based on that. So it is possible, but the problem is it takes time. There are no quick fixes. And now there's this debate between, shall we just focus on development and EU funds, which are available plenty, and the EU is ready to do that, but the conditionality, we should use that word, and it is at the end of the day rule of law.
Thank you very much. Wojciech, you said that being self-critical is one of the values of Europe, and indeed it is. And in fact, this is Christopher's point about autocracies. They are not self-critical, which is why they usually fail, ultimately. However, to be seriously self-critical, you have to have also a degree of self-belief. And if you don't have belief in your history, for example, I don't want to stress this on the last panel today, where two historians will be debating the importance of history, indeed the return of history, as it's called. But some of you may have seen the coronation. A great moment in the coronation, of course, is the great anthem, Zadok, the priest, written by a great English, aka German, composer, Handel. And there were protests about this from the woke tendency, who said that Handel was the product of a patriarchal system that had been underpinned by slavery, and his music should be banned. And there have been really serious attempts to ban Beethoven's music in concert halls in the United States. If you trash the ancestors, which is what this is all about, if you have no belief in your history, if you have no historical heroes that people can look up to, and heroes will always change, of course. I mean, that's important, because history is about reinterpretation, of course. Can you actually have a value system at all? And can you assimilate people? Assimilate is a very dodgy word, of course, but can you assimilate people if you actually don't believe in anything?
I think it's central, and I come from a country in which actually most, not that much maybe about Britain, but definitely in Poland, most of the polarization is about the reinterpretation of history and which history you will believe about ourselves, Poles. And we have actually a government which is conducting currently a right-wing wokeism. They want to cancel a lot of our recent history and erase a lot of political figures and attachments to certain values that came with those symbols in the society. And ultimately, they failed. The trouble is, of course, that the longer they try, the longer such an attempt also leaves a mark, and it's a wrong attempt. When I mentioned self-criticism, I didn't mean that self-criticism. It needs to come with a degree exactly respect for the source that's of a nation, I would say, the symbols, and on which you can build your criticism, of course. So I don't think we have any.
No.
I can stop simply here because I think.
No, I was just trying to make a point through you. Thank you. It's the art of ventriloquist. Christopher, I used to give lectures at the Royal College of Defence Studies for 25 years on democracy. When I started in the mid-90s, everyone thought democracy was the wave of the future. In the last 25 years, 25 democracies have disappeared. 3 of them in Europe, or in the European world, let's put it that way. Does the future belong to autocracy, or does it belong to democracy? Discuss. Don't run over the 45 minutes thing.
I'm not going to dodge that question. I think it's an indirect answer. One of the reasons why this is a political opinion expressed by me personally, not my institution, it's me. With regards to the war in Ukraine by Russia, for all sorts of reasons, one of them, not the least of them, is the West has invested so much economic, military, above all political, and social capital in this conflict, this war, that it would be a disaster for the values we've been talking about if Ukraine lost, or to put it another way, if Russia was not seen to fail. So that my answer to your question is, not watch this space, but to highlight that this is not just a war. This is kind of for me, it's personally and in a broader sense, a fundamental pivot. Pivot's an engineering term from Sierra Hills, anyway. It's a fundamental pivot, if you like, in history, where the stakes are so high. So, in answer to your question, if there's a decent result, and by decent result, Russia is not got its way in all the things that it has done, then I think there will be knock-on consequences for autocracy, not the least of which would be China. Not the least reason that as we speak, as this year has gone by, the lessons from Ukraine's surprising ability to forestall Russia. All experts sitting in the bars before February 22, they were all debating about 4 or 5 weeks, and there are 500 people we need to get out, i.e. the very same 500 people that Putin's boards wanted to kill. Over that same period of time, Taiwan has not been slow in quietly learning the fundamental lessons of defense from this conflict. And we all know that. How much we know, we can chat about. China knows that too. So its comfortable confidence in doing a Ukraine in Taiwan is certainly altered and is altering as we speak. I'm not saying they're not try, because going back to my point about autocracies and advice, you just thought Putin would have not been taking the risks that he did against the advice of his general staff, not against the advice of his cabal, and to have his troops, or allow them to have their full dress uniforms to go marching when the mission was over, all of that. So I think a lot rests on the result, and the stakes are that high, in my opinion. I mean, this is a discussion we can talk.
Thank you. Of course, we know that President Macron does not think that Taiwan is Europe's problem, but i.e. that British slight attack on the French to one side. It goes with the territory. I know people will be wanting to ask questions, but I do think it would be very valuable if we could ask Dominic Lieber to just say a few words about the Russian values, Dominic, in the context of this discussion that we're having, and then Sumatra, if you would be kind enough to say a few words about Turkey values and the whole membership question. Dominic.
All right, Christopher, thank you so much for asking me to explain Russian history in 2 minutes. Look, I would start by saying that fascism was a European ideology which came to power with mass support in the heartland of Western civilization, Italy, Germany. You can't get more than that. It failed not because of internal opposition, but because to some extent the British held out on their island, but above all because the Americans invaded Western Europe. 1. 2, Russia in 1900.
Can we wait for the microphone?
Oh, sorry, I better stand up as well.
Oh,
Do I need to repeat that?
No, we don't.
Thank God.
Point 2, I would say that in 1900, Russia is what I call the European Second World, peripheral Europe. Stretches from Ireland and Iberia in the west through most of Italy in the south, out to the Balkans and then the Russian Empire. Defining the Second World, huge peasantries, much poorer countries, smaller middle classes, less regional, let alone national integration, etc., etc. Weaker states, in the sense of being actually to penetrate society. For instance, the Italian state did not succeed in turning most peasants, or even most of the urban population of the south, into Italians. A point to note, almost none, Ireland's a very interesting exception, of the countries of the European Second World had a peaceful transition to liberal democracy. Almost all of them were ruled by authoritarian regimes of the right or the left between the two wars. Again, the triumph of liberal democracy is the triumph of the Allied victory in Western and Central Europe. One of the great triumphs, I think, of the EU has been precisely it has enabled the western and southern periphery of Europe to enter the First World. The big challenge has been since 1989 whether it would repeat that success in the East. So we'll see. Third point, I'm sorry, you've set me off, Christopher, but I live in Japan. You know, there you were talking about a country which is now ruled according to Western principles, but is far more alien traditionally to those principles than Russia, obviously. And yet I think those principles have put down deep roots, and that is of overwhelming importance. In the end, whether Taiwan is supported by Japan is going to be a matter of emotion and shared values, as much as it is going to be one of geopolitics. Very importantly and interestingly, this is by far the most important issue in Japanese politics. It's not going to be mentioned in next year's elections. The population is not trusted, and perhaps correctly not trusted, to make decisions on such matters. But those will be matters of life and death for the Japanese people. And if the Japanese cough out, American support for Taiwan will fail. And actually, I'm afraid the American-Chinese confrontation is, however horrible this whole business in Ukraine is, and hugely important, the Chinese-American confrontation over Taiwan is 10 times more important, because this will determine the future. And that comes me back to Russia. Look, this battle between European and ethnic Russian, traditional Russian values, goes right back into the 19th century. Although the conservatives, Slavophils, who developed the nationalist counterpoint, did actually draw very heavily on German, in particular, romantic and conservative thinking. In the last years of Tsarism, it looked as if the Western camp was coming out on top. I'm afraid I am a pessimist about that. It seems to me that of all the likely scenarios in early 20th century Russia, the least likely was the triumph of liberal democracy. I think it is far easier to imagine actually the emergence of communism, if not one, of an authoritarian nationalist regime with strong fascist elements. So we come back now to the post-1989. I was going to say this evening, but look, maybe say it now briefly. Russian liberals, the Russian pro-Western groups which temporarily held power, faced one hell of a difficult challenge. You know, to put this in British terms, you would have to imagine the overnight collapse of the British Empire in the 1930s, when most British people thought it was a fact of nature and basically benevolent. You would have to combine that with a worse recession than the 1930s, the collapse of the parliamentary monarchy and of the uniparliamentary government, which is the collapse of the Communist Party and the Soviet political structure. And you would have to combine it with the secession of Scotland and Wales, which is Ukraine and Belarus, but it isn't, because Ukraine is much more difficult for the Russians. No Englishman ever denied that the Scots were a separate nation. No Englishman ever thought that the origins of English statehood and religion were in Scotland, because they bloody obviously weren't. But of course the origins of Russian the statehood and religion were indeed on the territory of what is now Ukraine. So they faced a very difficult challenge. And in principle, if the Japanese can become part of the West, of course, the Western element in Russia could reassert itself. It's frankly going to depend, going back to what Christopher said, on the huge geopolitical competition which is going on under our eyes, which is not, in a sense, anything fundamentally new. In the 20th century, we had competition between three great geopolitical, ideological, ethno-linguistic blocs: the Germans, the Russian Slavic and then Communist bloc, and the Anglos, the Anglo-Americans. The Anglo-Americans won. That's why we're living in the world we are. Now we've got a different kind of conflict, because it was well predicted before 1914, at some point, the Industrial Revolution and the Post-Industrial Revolution was going to spread to China. And when it did, China's sheer resources were going to make it a huge challenge, and it is obviously far more difficult to bring China into our world, the liberal democratic world, than it was Germany before the First World War. This is far more alien. So we've got one hell of a problem. And whether Russia, in the end, swings back towards the Western camp is in the end going to depend on whether what we call liberalism wins in the West, and whether it outpoints China in global competition. And the jury is out, and what makes it nastier is that on top of China being a bigger challenge than Germany was, we also have climate change, which is going to put the most enormous pressures on all governments and is going to make it increasingly difficult to sustain liberal values everywhere. I mean, after all, those people who are going to be opposing the vast-scale immigration from Africa that climate change is probably going to inspire will be doing so partly by appealing to what they call European values, preserving the authentic, traditional culture of Europe. And of course, they won't be entirely wrong. So we've got a problem.
Thank you very much. Samantha, you say something about Turkey.
Right. I'll give it a shot. First of all, values are not necessarily unchanging. They can and do change over time. So, for example, even 3 decades ago, a theory of Asian values, quote unquote, being incompatible with liberal democracy had a lot of currency, right? And this was proved wrong empirically when such countries as Taiwan and South Korea, among others, successfully transitioned from authoritarian regimes to functional liberal democracies. So the theory of Asian values being incompatible with liberal democracy proved to be empirically wrong. Likewise, some of you would know that in India, the country I come from, one of the greatest blights of our society has been the caste system and its hierarchies. And the most egregious manifestation of that for many hundreds of years, perhaps even thousands of years, has been the practice of untouchability. Currently, we are more than 1.4 billion strong now. 1 out of every 6 Indians. So that is 250 million people, nearly, somewhere between 200 and 250 million people, belong to the erstwhile untouchable caste groups. Okay, so this was a feature of Indian social life and organization for centuries, if not millennia. But when the Constitution of the Republic of India was proclaimed in 1950, it outlawed untouchability. So Article 17 of the Constitution bans the practice of untouchability in any form. And a few years later, the practice of untouchability in any form was made a criminal offense. So, under the Indian Penal Code. Now, what this means is that the Republic of India signaled its intent. Of course, the reality is different. It is still a live issue today, caste discrimination, prejudice, and inequalities. But the Republic of India signaled its intent to turn its back, turn the page, and turn its back on quote-unquote tradition that had been an integral part of social and national life for hundreds of years. So values, can and do change, with the times. Now about Turkey, in the 1920s and 1930s, the formative period of the Republic of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of the Turkish Republic, equated civilization with Western modernity, and specifically with Europe. And Turkey, the new Republic of Turkey, which is going to be 100 years old this coming October, was going to not just join Europe, but become European, culturally European. So he said in a speech in 1927 that the Ottoman Empire has passed in perpetuity into the dustbin of history. And we have now got to not just join the West, but become European, culturally, psychologically, behaviorally, etc. Now that's a clear signaling of intent of what the value system of the new republic, modern 20th century Republic of Turkey should be. Now that is the intent, but in my short response to your question, Christopher, is that it is about values, okay, and unfortunately the values of the Republic of Turkey, which is going to celebrate its centenary in a few months' time, in October, are incompatible with the professed values of the present-day European Union, with all its problems. Now, why is that? Yesterday I did say that there is perhaps, probably in fact, more continuity than change between Kemalist and post-Kemalist Turkey. So, 100-year history of the Turkish Republic, 8 of those 10 decades have been the Kemalist era until 20 years ago. It's only in the last 20 years that Kemalism has yielded to a post-Kemalist era dominated by Erdogan. Now, I don't need to bang on about Erdogan's, both his domestic politics and increasingly his geopolitical stances being incompatible with the values of the present-day European Union. That's true. But much more continuity than change. Well, what are the key differences? First of all, secularism has been jettisoned as a principle of the state, and the military, which was the arbiter of Turkish politics for many decades, the recurrent coups and all of that, has been tamed and thoroughly defanged by Erdogan. But otherwise, the continuities are very striking, including this tradition of authoritarian, state power, a winner-take-all, zero-sum approach to politics, and a personality cult with Erdogan supplanting Atatürk. I'll end by telling you, what the values of Kemalist Turkey, which have endured with these two, changes in the post-Kemalist era were. If you were following the Turkish presidential election and parliamentary election last month, you may have seen that in the reports from the CHP headquarters, the Republican People's Party, the Kemalist Party, the main opposition party of Turkey, the main opposition to Erdogan, 6 arrows, that's their symbol. This was proclaimed in the 1930s as the guiding principles of the Turkish Republic. And what are the 6 arrows? The 6 arrows are republicanism, nationalism, populism, statism or étatisme, okay, secularism or racism, likely, and revolutionism or reformism, which is not specified what exactly this means, except it talks about unitary state power, one-party state, and a rigidly unitary and centralized state. So basically, what we have here, if you look at the 6 arrows from the vantage point of 2023, back to the 1930s when they were adopted, and the CHP still clearly, professes the 6 arrows. The only one of the 6 arrows, republicanism, nationalism, populism, statism or étatisme, secularism or racism, and revolutionism or reformism, the only one Erdogan would not like and disagree with and seek to omit is secularism or racism. Otherwise the other 5 arrows are fine. And so this is the state of the political culture, and that cuts across this alleged great divide between the Turkish political Islamism represented by Erdogan and his opposition. One last point, and I can't resist, making this. One of the key priorities of the European Union, rightly, is the treatment of minorities. Yes, and we all know the fate of the Kurds in Turkey, not even recognized as a community that exists until 20 years ago. That was what Kemalism did, what it was about. And of course that has changed, but since 2015, Erdogan has reverted to the old, not the denial of Kurdish identity as such, but the old methods of draconian repression. That is another continuity. One last point on a personal note. I was recently rereading my mother's will. She died 3 years ago. And in a kind of a preamble to the actual contents of the will, the specific provisions, she said, we, meaning she and my father, we tried to give our children values, inculcate in our children values both traditional and universal. So what does she mean by that? I mean, I know what she means by that. She tried to give us, she and my father, tried to give us the best of the Indian traditions as they saw it. There are many good things in Indian tradition, but there's a clear reference to values both traditional and universal. And I think that among other things, I'm quite sure, what she means is the values of the dignity of individuals, of political pluralism, of respect, for cultural diversity, and the basic, rights and freedoms of citizens. So I regard this as being universal values, not just European values or Indian values, but universal values. But I trust I've answered your question about Turkey. Why it's completely incompatible with the framework, the value framework of the European Union. Thanks.
In other words, we've been wasting our time since 1960.
Yes.
But no one is brave enough to admit it on either side. Okay, let's open it up. Eric.
I have a counterfactual.
You need a microphone, I think.
Maybe I'll just ask quickly. I have a counterfactual to Wojciech, but also to everyone in the panel. You're also optimistic. It's still like
I'm very hoarse this morning.
Yes, because I spent time with a pessimist. That's right.
And with the smokers.
Yes, but I have a very different memory of the European response to the pandemic and to vaccine policy, which Wojciech, you praised. My memory is the first vaccine that became available was Sputnik from Russia, and despite EU vaccine policy, some countries actually applied Sputnik. I know this personally because I was offered and given Sputnik in Hungary well before yes, now you understand everything. The chip's working. Right? Well before Pfizer and AstraZeneca became available. And when Pfizer and AstraZeneca became available, there was an enormous shortage. If you remember that when they first became available, there was a fight with the Polish government and said, what's this? You're only sending this much. Germany's taking the bulk here, or Holland, as I recall. The other aspect that I recall is the first country, or the first authority to send really massive medical aid was not headquartered in any European country. It was not Brussels, it was China. China sent tons and tons of medical aid, specifically to the Western Balkans, and sent medical advisors saying, this is how we're dealing with it if you first with us. Already when the fire was still burning very hot in Italy. So I have a different memory.
No.
to answer that. And you're not the only one. I think Russians and Chinese seized the moment to spread this propaganda. If you remember, in Italy, they were landing these divisions of doctors, and I say divisions because they were not doctors, which Italian press discovered quite quickly. They were landing essentially spies in Italy through this so-called vaccine response. The other thing is that in Hungary, even after you were vaccinated with Sputnik, you immediately were advised by the very same government not to continue Sputnik and this Chinese.
No.
But you were given other options.
No.
No,
I'm sorry. I got the letters in Hungarian. No, I was told to take. If you get Sputnik, you take 2 Sputnik.
Yeah.
Chinese vaccine wasn't really available. My neighbor waited for Pfizer, and she had to wait weeks and weeks and weeks for Pfizer, and was isolating herself. No, it's not true. If you got Sputnik, you were told keep with Sputnik. It was only when the 3rd vaccine became available, which the Hungarian government did not. She would suggest because it died down by then. Hungary had a fortune, let's say.
Hungary had the biggest mortality rate at the same time from all the countries.
If you went to a Hungarian hospital, you died.
Yeah, that's another thing. So what I just want to say, what I wanted to say on the policy question, Eric, imagine that there was no EU response, because EU is not designed to have a response in the pandemic as it did. And what would happen then to Hungary? You would be given second-rate Chinese or Hungarian, Russian Sputnik vaccines, while the bigger states, in Germany for sure, would be receiving their own parts, and the mortality rate would be even higher. So that's on the, as I say, I'm optimist, meaning I say it could have been worse. I don't say it was great. And again, I would stress that pandemic initially caught the West by surprise and was utilized and used by Chinese and Russia strategic communication for trying to demonstrate that we are weak, we cannot do things, and they deliver. But it was quickly discovered it was all fake. It's like with Chinese GDP. If the research, Chicago University research on comparing the light intensity from the sky, from satellite images around the world is correlated with GDP, then it's not really true. It's not for no reason that in the Soviet or communist countries we have had and still have, those ministries of statistics. It's a political thing for them to say what are the numbers and what's the window dressing, and they probably still put much more emphasis to saying that, and then to have us believe that they could have delivered more. I still think, and I will defend that the pandemic brought EU not to the maximum of its potential, but it actually showed that EU is not so EU response and Western response altogether. With all the quarreling and also handling, and the Polish government doing stupid things. At the end of the day, we have lots of vaccine in our in our storages bought by the Polish government that citizens, because of this, also many processes were not utilizing fully. But it wouldn't be full, it wouldn't be available if we were not having this collective response. And by the way, just a little remark, it also doesn't mean that countries individually were not innovative and managing better, but they were doing it collectively. Visegrad Group countries actually established first digital ministers' response units to online and continuously in the first days of the pandemic to exchange information, and then infusing these ideas also that EU could do a little bit better. It's all about innovation, as I said, and ability to learn and adapt.
Just briefly to complete what was said, for the sake of being fair and give it to the EU was extremely self-critical of how we handled the early days of the pandemic. pandemic, because it was completely absent from both the mask diplomacy and the vaccine diplomacy. However, in the later stage, the EU did become the biggest donor, not only of vaccines, but also of testing equipment and handling the immediate post-vaccination period. So I think it's in the end a question also of how communication was handled, and probably that was the worst part of all. In addition to, of course, the EU not being designed for that kind of emergency response. But in the meantime, I think we can safely say that we have built capacities, and we have managed to counter that. However, we still have to work a lot on the communication side and on self-PR, if nothing, because I mean both the Russian and the Chinese are very good at it. And we also have to not be offering social.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I have
Thank you very much for your presentations and for the discussion that was just happening. Right now I have two questions regarding trade-offs related to strategic competition and European values. And I would like to hear the first question related to EU foreign policy and the EU neighborhood from Ms. Popa and from Chris. So what we have currently is an increasing strategic competition, to call it like this, in the neighborhood of the EU. Let's take, for instance, the Western Balkans, where we have China, Russia, the US, the EU competing for influence and competing to shape and reshape the region. We also have some minor actors such as Turkey, which is also trying to influence this. And this competition creates trade-offs between dealing in a more realpolitik, pragmatic logic, and pursuing values and defending and promoting values. This creates an inherent trade-off. And it's not clear to me how the EU is dealing with this trade-off. And how can it find a proper balance between acting in a realpolitik type of behavior when competing with other great powers, but at the same time pursuing and fostering its European values. So how do you think that the EU should deal with this? And the second question is internal. We have challenges regarding liberal European values and our key basic institutions, which come from member states and which come from within states, from various social groups. So here I see another trade-off between our need to safeguard our liberal institutions and values, but at the same time allow actors, groups, states to challenge and contest institutions and patterns of behavior which they find to be inadequate or abhorrent, right? Our very European values guarantee the right to challenge, to contest, to be open, to have freedom of expression. We have what Hungarian / British intellectual will call the paradox of freedom. How do we deal with that too? How do we deal with the need to, on the one side, safeguard our values, but on the other side, enable them to use those very values to challenge key institutions? Thank you.
Very good. Why don't we start with Chris?
On the second question.
Whichever.
The second.
Yeah.
It's a long story. I think one of the problems underlying your question is it goes a bit back to Christopher's point about self-critique and self-belief, which I think is a profoundly important point. That if you believe in the freedom of speech, the cut and thrust of debate, you can see it in the physical expression at that point. You're quite confident, I'm up for it. I'm not frightened. Bring it on. bring on your dodgy ideology and we'll challenge it. And if you go to the other extreme, you say, well, actually, I've heard too much of this horrible ideology. I don't want to hear any more. I'm happy for you. I'm going to tolerate you going off into another room and talking about it, and I'll stay here and talk with people of my own persuasion. The difference between those two things is the second one, which is about safe spaces, is based on giving up the first value and having a compartmentalization, which is also based on a rather dangerous, in my view, of all these different views are equal, but they're never challenged because they're put into their safe spaces. And I think that's a really big challenge. And Ratiu, you made this point about, I wrote down, tradition and universal. It's the same sort of argument. It's not a question of mixing a cake of tradition and universal. It's rather the universal is the framework within which one encourages tradition and other values to be generated, be renewed. So my answer to the question, I suppose, it goes back to confidence and enshrining these fundamental rights. Because if you nibble away at them and you make exceptions, it's a slippery slope down to authoritarianism with good intentions or not, bad intentions. So I feel my point about safe space, cancel culture, all the rest of it, makes it's evidence you've given up belief, or you've given up self-confidence. And I feel that's a sad point. And to repeat something I said at the end of my contribution, it's something that those hostile to European values will play on in social media and other ways. So that's a long answer to a very important second answer. I'll leave the first question.
Thank you. We need to be very precise here when we talk about interference and influence. So for the Western Balkans in particular, I think there are two main lanes. One is disinformation and the other one is investments. So Russia plays partially on the dependency of Russian gas with some countries to export instability. Russia has minimal investment in the Western Balkans. It's not really an economic player there, except a little bit in Serbia, but not much. So its main specialty is disinformation, either directly or through proxies. And there we invest a lot, again, probably we're not communicating well enough through the foreign policy instrument, in working with all the governments of the Western Balkans on disinformation, cybersecurity, and so on. Then you have the economic realm where you have a competition in real terms. And it's not necessarily between the EU and the US. Of course, there are American interests, but that's not the main issue here. They're Chinese mostly, and China is trying very hard to rebrand itself in the Western Balkans these days. But there's also Turkey, which I would not consider a minor actor. They're quite present in some countries, and the UAE also is coming strong from behind. And here the big issue is, and you know that, the conditionality of EU-funded mega projects is extremely difficult. It takes time, it's sustainable, and it's clean, but it's difficult. And people become impatient. And one of the best examples is the famous Chinese highway in Montenegro, which was an easy fix, but it broke all the ceilings of a regular highway. What we are currently looking at, and I spoke a little bit earlier about this, is finding ways to make accession to those funds, to make those funds accessible in an easier way from the main European donors, such as the EIB or the EBRD, whether we talk about loans or direct investment and so on. Because we risk losing time and projects and opening the gate for unwanted competition. So this is what I can say at this point.
Well, I have other points, but I don't necessarily have anything to add here.
But since you invited me to say something, I will say something if I may. It really goes back to what we were discussing yesterday about this is values versus interests, stability or values. And the European Union is not in the happy position it was in the 1990s. When you may remember, it rewrote the Lomé Conventions, these are the trade agreements, with what we used to call third world countries in those days, retrospectively rewrote them to include human rights provisions. Now, the rule of the law is very clear that you cannot retrospectively change a treaty. You have to renegotiate a treaty. You can't rewrite it just because you decided you want something else. The EU can't do that now. And of course, with the point that Dominic Lieven made about migration. Migration is the make or break issue for the European Union in the next 20 years. We're going to be much more, I think, realistic and put stability first. Now, of course, there are people who would argue it's only by forcing human rights that you can actually stop people from migrating. That's a different argument. But I do think that we're going to go into the interests rather than the values area. Could I just say one last thing about universalism? Universalism has always existed, not if you talk the language of rights, which is a European language, very specific to 18th and early 19th century Europe. Why? Because if you remember the Rights of Man, which is the first document ever to identify these rights, it's the rights of man and the citizen, with the understanding that only citizens have rights. Therefore, you had to have republican constitutions, not in 1789 republican necessarily, but you had to have a liberal constitution, and their understanding of liberal, which is different from ours. And that's a very European discourse, tightly grounded in European history. But identifying human wrongs is something that we've been doing for thousands of years, and societies have had that debate with themselves about wrongs. The best example of that is what was called the crossroads cut. If you were a samurai warrior, it took 20 years to get the skills, swordsmanship skills. You were allowed to exercise your skills by decapitating any peasant who came across at a crossroads. This was the law. In the 18th century, they changed it. You were allowed to go into prisons and decapitate criminals while they were alive, by the way, but not at crossroads. In the 19th century, they abolished that law. You were not allowed to practice your swordsmanship at the expense of other Japanese. Foot binding was not brought to an end in China by the Christian missionaries. It was brought to an end by Chinese intellectuals who had this debate around about 1900. And sati, for example, the burning of widows. The widows supposed to burning themselves. That was not introduced by the British initially. It was petitioned by Bengali intellectuals to the government of India at the time to stop this practice, because there'd been a lot of criticism for a long time about it amongst Indians themselves. So I think if we can try to understand what is wrong about social practices and human behavior, we would be, I think, making a progressive step. If you start using the language of rights as you as a European understand that, you're going to have a dialogue of the death. Now that's very pessimistic, and I'm sure you're not going to support that idea at all, but I just put it forward. I think we need to get on because time is moving. Can we take a couple of questions? Beginning.
Well, thank you. First of all, just one comment. I got my vaccine in Romania faster than in Milan. And I came here and I did it. But anyway, moving to what you were saying, from my 3 industrial boards and conversation with EBRD and PDI, everything, I have the impression often that values, on which we can discuss forever, have to be sustained. And when I have been in Brussels at the beginning of the year 2000, we were discussing watch out with anti-dumping, watch out with the Chinese, da 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 da. And when we go to Brussels now, and we try to explain to them that, you know, you cannot build a community on debt without having the technology. I would like to be English today. There is not a single steel pipe for making a cannon. But I mean, it's not just steel. But, you know, where are the macro decisions? Because we're discussing about values, fine. But I don't see anyone discussing about sustainability of these values. And I think the European Union often is really ignorant on how you make an economy function, how microchips are important. Now we are all learning with Taiwan, we need microchip now. Even the conversion to electricity is the first time in history that it's been imposed on us as a tax. When vapor came in, we were very happy because we were faster than sales. And now we have a European Union that is only imposing things. And I think there's a general irritation among the industrialists. And this is not just wanting to be subsidized. This is the argument. The truth is that we are lacking technology. And technology is what makes your values and our values sustainable. And in a way, I get to the extreme of saying that Trumpism, which I detested, understood that much better than Obamism or whatever you call it. So my question is, but where is the issue? The issue of sustainability, is it related to values or not?
Thank you. Let's just take one more question. No, go ahead.
We talked a lot today and even yesterday about the way in which the despots are interfering and undermining our Western values, and the way in which they do it, disinformation, etc., etc. Whereas it seems to me that the West, the EU, US, just generally the Western nations, they kind of take for granted their populations that, our populations, they all know already how bad these regimes are, these despotic regimes and so on. So they're totally lethargic in actually going, as like Christopher said, to attacking the weaknesses of the despots and somehow conveying that message to the rest of the world, particularly like we're talking the global South, who back Russia. The whole Indian continent probably thinks that Russia their values are much better than, or make more sense in today's world than European values. So why is it that the West doesn't make more of an effort to deliver its message to all of those, let's say, uncertain states around the world? We don't see it happening. Should be happening.
Christopher, let's start with you.
On that
Oh, whichever.
yes.
Or both.
I mean, a short answer to your question. The lack of effort in communication and persuasion, I think, is it lack of effort? Perhaps it's a belated effort. And the global south is a clear priority, obviously it's been triggered by the war in Ukraine. I think one of the reasons for belated efforts, and I agree, is why should you try and persuade people to do this or to do that when the example is in front of you? It's kind of a complacent view that what we have is so good. And of course, we have the evidence, that's why people want to come. So that's one of the reasons. I think it's complacency.
Okay, I will try to answer the sustainability versus values questions. So, first of all, there is a discussion that started at the level of the European Commission on this. Before the war in Ukraine started, there was a discussion about how to structure the next cycle of IPA, of the Instrument for Pre-Accession, and the idea was more for more. So the more reforms countries, candidate countries perform, the more money they will get. I think that the issue is circular, it's not even a two-way street, which determines the other. But today, in light of the energy crisis and how much is focused now on that and the green transition, it's definitely an idea that the EU needs to invest in order to prompt those values to hold. But this is a very dangerous conversation because this is exactly what some of the countries are trying to exploit. They're saying, give us the money to carry out sustainable projects, which we can present, and therefore improve the economy and the life of our citizens. But then internally, let us do our own thing, and that is something we cannot, agree on. Because, like I said before, this has to be done in tandem, whether we're talking about rule of law or internal reforms and the economic development. And then the other problem is internal at the EU level, where, for example, you have the European Commission having a very good strategy or plan on how to do this, and you have the European Bank for Investment that has different conditionalities that are incompatible or take too much time. The European Commission would like to see these processes moving faster, but then the EIB is sort of holding behind because there are feasibility studies that need to be done, and the process is very, very slow, and the money is only released if this, and that. First of all, probably, but that's a question that you probably get a better answer in Brussels. First, internally, things should be harmonized on how to do them, and then apply them to candidate countries in this sustainability versus value, and which comes first.
Yeah, I would like to bring to your attention that the question, as I understand, about societies getting seduced also by easy answers about non-democratic. It's a good question, and I think there's a good example of how you can go about it. In the Baltics, as you know, there is a Russian minority living there, and they even benefit, some of them, because of their legacy pension schemes that a lot of the money come from Russia to especially pensioners who deserve the pension based on the USSR lifetime work. The questions to them were, since they were also prone to Russian disinformation, whether they would choose to have a Russian passport and choose to support Russia. And the answer is no. So despite being prone, kind of being even sometimes vocal, when it comes to a decision point that you think through and talk through consequences of certain ideas and temptations, society is not that stupid. And people prefer altogether fair deals for themselves, and also because we are usually thinking about our children. It's the whole opportunity for them. And the answer, I think, is to really ask the questions and ask people to imagine the consequences of these questions. This is what I would say is necessary also by asking not the question of how Russia will lose this war, but actually how Russia can win this war and what will happen when Ukraine loses. And I think these questions we're not often brave to put in the public, but we need these questions to mobilize ourselves and to see what is at stake. In the same line of argumentation that you, Christopher, brought, I think these are really important. Equally, what will we do when Trump is back? Because Trump is likely coming back in next year, yes. What's our strategy? what do we do in Europe? And I think we need to start thinking about it. Maybe it's going to be somehow, we'll muddle through, we always muddle through as human race, but how? And I think that this is important, because it not necessarily bring the total destruction, but it will be very, very different worlds from what we're having now.
Right, well on that note, I think I should release you back into the community, as we say. People come out of prison. And to lunch. The last time I found myself seated on the edge of a table at a panel a few years ago, we were on a platform, a very narrow platform. And as one of the panelists, my fellow panelists, got up to speak, he knocked me completely off the platform. And it was my turn to speak. I said, I now discover there's only one thing worse than being upstaged by a fellow panelist, and that's being downstage. I have the bruises still to prove that story. I'd like to thank our three speakers. Great different approaches and different subjects and topics were covered, and I'd like to thank the audience as well for their questions. We'll see you after lunch.